and I'm going to make these recordings available to you too. So this sort of makes up in part from me not using the whiteboard as much. I like to doodle when I'm talking, but it doesn't really come through very well on Zoom. And if I show something, if I project something, again, I've got a challenge of trying to make that available online and in classrooms. So we're relying a little bit more on me talking to you, our discussion, and recording that. So we spent quite a bit of time on the first, introducing the Gospel of Luke, and then talking about the first 3 chapters. Anyone have any initial comments about reading the Gospel of Luke? Maybe particularly people who are approaching this for the first time, have never read the text. I'm not expecting a show of hands, but anything that was surprising to anyone, and you started reading the Gospel of Luke, something that you didn't expect. Just curious about that. Something unexpected in the Gospel of Luke. Yeah.
Well, in the questions, he talks about like the long opening of John the Baptist and how like he sets up this whole like Jesus fulfills this prophecy that he's been telling people for like forever. So is that doesn't occur in every gospel, right?
Okay, and your name again is
Tara.
Tara mentioned, yeah, the long setup with the long passage about the birth of John the Baptist. Yes, that's absolutely right. In the Gospel of Mark, John the Baptist is about 3 or 4 verses. That's it. And you have 100 verses practically in Luke. So it's totally disproportionate. It's like 20 times as long in Luke. So this is something that is unique to Luke. And so I guess if you want to turn the comment into a question, it's like, well, what's the deal here? Why would Luke spend so long on John? Anybody have any thought on that, or there isn't necessarily just one answer? Yeah.
I wasn't totally sure. It seemed like because he brought him into the limelight, he's an important figure, and he also had a similar beginning with his mother being approached by an angel.
Okay. And sorry, you are Ryan. Yes. Ryan? Yeah, right. Okay, Ryan comments, yeah, the parallelism between the angel appearing to Zacharias, the angel appearing to Mary, John, Jesus. There's a sense in which John is the last Old Testament prophet, and Jesus is the beginning of the new age that is emerging. And so John is the linchpin. He's the nexus between one age and another age. And Luke, in a very skillful way, is showing how Jesus, the word dovetail, like taking my fingers like this, how they fit. So John and Jesus, the Old Testament, the Hebrew era dovetails into the Jesus era. Jesus is not for Luke the contradiction of everything that came before. He's the fulfillment of it. And we find that statement also in the Gospel of Matthew 5:17. It says, do not think, this is in the Sermon on the Mount, I came to abolish the law and the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. Again, that's Matthew 5:17, but that's part of Luke's presentation as well, that Jesus is completing what's already been there. At the same time, Jesus is stepping beyond. As we said before, there are differences between, John the Baptist seems a little bit more of a hellfire preacher. Now, Jesus talked about hell. He talked about judgment as well. It would be wrong to ignore that. But there's more on the mercy of God that's more obvious in what's presented from Jesus. Anything else that just struck anyone about these opening, the first half or so of Luke, or however far you've got? Anyone in the chat? You have a comment, a general observation? Okay, let me go to the homework questions. I don't think we need to to go in depth into the first chapters. We talked a lot about the first 3 chapters, trying to set the context. We need to move a little bit more quickly. We talked about the Magnificat, the Benedictus, the speech of Mary, the speech of Zacharias. We talked about the birth of Jesus. And in Luke 3, people coming to be baptized by John. One question we didn't talk about in class, what about Jesus being baptized by John? Did anyone have a thought about that? Put it this way, to put it provocatively, if this is a baptism for the remission of sins, remission or forgiveness of sins, then if Jesus is being baptized, does that mean that Jesus is a sinner like everyone else coming to the Jordan River?
Misunderstood that part is like Jesus opening up the it's like right after it says that the Holy Spirit opened up the sky
Okay.
and like proclaimed Jesus as God's son. So I feel like
Yes. Okay.
that was like a necessary step.
Okay. Tara mentioned the important thing mentioned in multiple gospels that the Spirit descended upon Jesus at that moment. So there's something about the baptism that is the inauguration of the ministry of Jesus. It is true that it was described as a baptism for the remission of sins, but one person put it this way, that Jesus was numbered with the transgressors when he died. If you know the ending of the Gospel of Luke, he was crucified between the two thieves, the three crosses. Many of us have seen that image, Jesus in the middle, the thief on either side. So the saying is that he was numbered with the transgressors when he began his ministry too. The sinners are all coming, responding to the baptism of John, and Jesus is standing among them. And actually in Matthew's gospel, I'm trying to remember, get my gospel straight here, but in Matthew's gospel, it says that when Jesus came to John, Luke just records the baptism, but in Matthew, John actually tries to prevent Jesus from being baptized, says, I need to be baptized by you. So Matthew shows John acknowledging Jesus' superiority. And then Jesus says, kind of enigmatically, says, permit it at this time in this way it is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness. And it's like us, it's kind of like you and me, John and Jesus, together we are doing this work. And so, so Jesus, he humbles himself by identifying himself with the sinners. And again, that fits with the message of the cross later, that he identified himself with sinners. I think I asked you, let's see, I asked you about the temptation of Jesus. Let's see, I put that in chapter 3. I should have put that in chapter 4, but okay. I asked, if you were the devil, how would you go about tempting Jesus? That assumes you know something about Jesus' psychology. That's a little bit out there question, but think about that for a second. What would, from your understanding of who Jesus was or thought he was and presented himself to be, what would be the way that you would go about tempting him, diverting him from his path? Does anyone have a thought on that? Or I could change it a little bit. Say, what if you actually read the temptation passage in Luke 4? What was the what is behind the devil's temptation? What is he appealing to in Jesus to try to divert him? Anybody? Come on, you can all think diabolically.
I can respond. I don't know if you want me to just put it in the chat. Would that be
Okay, well, I can hear I can hear you if you I can repeat it. I'll repeat it, whatever you say, Anna.
Okay. Well, I think Satan tries to appeal to Jesus's human side and tries to, by taking away the food and any nourishment, he tries to kind of like weaken him to the point of like giving in. at least at like the beginning. And then later he tries to like kind of he tries to like go at his ego a little bit and like if you are God, you can just save yourself right now, yada yada yada.
Mm-hmm.
And like tries to get Jesus that way. Which
Okay.
like Satan probably knows how to tempt Jesus better than anyone. So I would do the same thing, I guess. I don't know.
Okay, did you all hear that in class? Could you hear that? Okay, good. You came through, actually that came through more clearly than I thought it would. Maybe we don't have to rely on the chat. We can experiment. We're all learning here. So Anna says the devil is appealing to Jesus' human side. One human side is hunger, right? Physical need. And Jesus had been fasting for 40 days. There are people, I have a friend in St. Louis who fasted for 40 days on water. He lost about 30 pounds. Believe it or not, there are people who do that. He's an extremely dedicated Christian leader. And I said, how are you? His name is, let's see, I'm trying to remember his name. But he said, oh, food is good. Food is good. Yeah, I hadn't eaten for 40 days. But 40 days is about the maximum you actually begin to run. Most people medically, if they're in good health, can go about that far. But then it says after that he became hungry. There's a kind of hunger apparently that comes at the end of the 40-day fast. I fasted 10 days on water. That was the longest I ever fasted. But after 40 days, your body has consumed all of its reserves. And the hunger, like you're on the verge of starvation, then you're going to die if you don't eat. And so that's the point that Satan comes along. So one of the things that you see is the devil is able to act in a strategic way. First of all, he uses more than one way of tempting, right? The devil is sort of here as the master strategist, right? So one is the hunger appeal. Anna mentioned the ego appeal, that he says, I will give you all this domain and its glory. He showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time. The devil tends to want people to make snap decisions. He doesn't want those that he's tempting to think about it, because then they might begin to reflect and think of the negative consequence. Like, oh, here it is. Look, all this glory, all this dominion, it's all yours if you'll fall down and worship me. Did you notice anything about how Jesus responded? Other than, did Jesus just say no, or did he do something other than just say no? There's something kind of right here in the text. Anybody?
He says, man shall not live on bread.
Okay, man shall not live. But before that, he says, no, Jesus says something before that.
Oh, I didn't have that.
Jesus answered and said, it is written.
Oh, right.
Yeah, that's the detail I wanted to talk about. It is written, it is written, it is written. Jesus, rather than just speaking from himself, he appeals to the Hebrew scriptures. The quotes are all from the book of Deuteronomy. Now, if you get deep into the symbolism here, the children of Israel had put God to the test in the wilderness, and the book of Deuteronomy was a book of instruction for them. And so it's like, as Israel failed the Lord in the Old Testament, remember the golden calf episode? Anyway, this is part of the Old Testament background. Jesus was obedient in the desert. So we have disobedience in the desert of Israel. Jesus is in effect the new Israel, the symbol of the nation who is faithful, so obedient. But he appeals to Scripture, and actually, there's a whole literature on this that in early Christian monasticism, saying that people that were the desert fathers, desert mothers, when they prayed, they would quote Scripture to the devil to defeat him with the written word. So there is an appeal to, Anna called it the appeal to ego. Maybe this is one way to think of this as a shortcut to glory, because the ultimate path that Jesus follows, and we could debate, how much did Jesus know his own future? Was that all accessible to him? If he's human and he's divine, that's the classical doctrine, then you could go more than one direction, right? Say, well, if he's divine, he must know everything. But if he's human, he can't know everything, right? Very complicated questions. But from the gospel narrative, we understand that Jesus had to endure suffering and rejection before he died, was risen again, and then rose in glory. So this is basically a shortcut. Like he didn't have to go this route. One of the films that I gave you some excerpts from was called The Last Temptation of Christ. It was a very controversial movie when it came out. You know the name Martin Scorsese? Famous director, one of the most famous. He did a bunch of films, Raging Bull, and a bunch of others. But this is a Scorsese movie, and there's a scene where Jesus is on the cross, and he's fantasizing the life that he might have had if he had married Mary Magdalene and had a family with her. So this almost like and this is where the title of the film comes, The Last Temptation of Christ. So that's not exactly what you have here, but it does seem like the devil who is tempting Jesus seems to be aware of his vocation, and he's trying to get him to the destination, but not through the suffering and the rejection of the cross. So, okay, so let's see. In the next chapter, I asked you about the chapter 4. Well, sorry, later in the same chapter, I should say, chapter 4. This reaction against Jesus in Nazareth. Okay, there may be more than one way we could interpret this, but why do you think the people got so angry at Jesus in this episode that they were? This is the religious gathering that turned into a lynch mob because they're circling around Jesus. I've actually stood on the hillside because I've been in the town of Nazareth when I went on a tour years ago, and there's a cliff right at the edge of town. It says they took him and they were going to throw him off, and it's thought there's a local tradition that this is the exact site. No one is completely sure, but there are a limited number of places it could be because of the geography right there. So they're about to throw him off. So what is it, do you think, that caused people to react so negatively during this inaugural homily that Jesus gave in his hometown?
I have an idea.
Yeah.
I think if you take it into like context, like, here's someone who's grown up in this town for about 30 years. There were probably a lot of people knew him. He went to school with a lot of people, and then went to Saturday, in the temple,
Uh-huh.
and then one day, 30 years later, he goes out into the desert for 40 days, comes back and proclaims he's the Messiah all of a sudden. So that must have been probably a kind of a weird shock to the people of Nazareth, and one they probably really didn't understand, were kind of angered by.
Okay. Ross is saying, that they're shocked that he's risen to this level. Now, whether they understood that Jesus was saying, here's a question, if I can just turn your comment into a question, would they have understood Jesus to say, I am the Messiah? Or do you think that came a little bit later?
I think they probably would have, kind of in the moment without understanding much, kind of maybe understood it that way.
Okay. If you look in the Gospel of Matthew, it's not till chapter 16 that Jesus says, who do people say that I am? And basically Peter and James and John, the first 12 apostles, they say, well, people say different things. Some say you are a prophet. Some say you are Elijah back from the dead. This idea that Elijah had come back again. Some say that you're, Jeremiah come back. And then Jesus says, who do you say that I am? And this is a famous passage because Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. So that's the first time it's explicit that anyone has confessed him to be Christ. And this is the closest followers of Jesus, and we're already more than halfway through Matthew. Now to go back to Ross's point, though, Jesus reads from Isaiah. And by the way, there's a version of this in one of the film clips I gave you where he reads from it's the younger Jesus reading from Isaiah. But then he rolls the scroll up, and then he says, look at verse 21. Luke chapter 4, verse 21. Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. Okay, that's a pretty astounding thing, because in the mind of the people in the synagogue, you know, the book that he's read, the book of Isaiah, scroll of the prophet Isaiah, this is like holy people that lived long ago. You know, wasn't it wonderful what God did long ago, far away? And Jesus, boom, he just brings it right into this moment. Like something is happening right here, right now to fulfill this. So if that's not a messianic claim, it's still a claim that something is happening right then and there. So that would have been startling. But then he goes on, is there anything else Ross has mentioned maybe this kind of messianic claim, or a claim to being someone special, even if it wasn't completely clearly focused in their mind. Anything else that could have upset them that we haven't talked about? Okay, I'll give you a couple of clues. Okay, in verse 23, no doubt you will quote this proverb, physician, heal yourself. Whatever we heard was done at Capernaum, do in your hometown as well. There's a certain hometown feeling here about like, hey, you're one of us. How come you're not here with us? You're traveling to these other towns. It'd be like if Bill Gates grew up in some little town, right? And they found out he'd just given, $500 million to endow a new expansion at Barnes Hospital, right? And then let's say he was from a little town in Missouri. He'd show up in a little town. What would the people in little town Missouri say? Bill Gates, you're one of ours. You grew up in our town. You gave $500 million. Can't you do something for us? You get the idea? They felt like they had a claim on him. And this comes up later in an almost shocking way with regard to Jesus' own family members. There's one passage later in Luke, if you haven't seen it yet, where Jesus is speaking, and they said, your mother and brothers are outside waiting to talk to you. And he says, who are my mother and my brother, my family members? He says, whoever does the will of God, hears the will of God and obeys it. It's a shocking statement because it seems like he's dissing his own mother. But what he's basically saying to these people from Nazareth is, you have to come to me on the same basis that everyone else comes to me. You don't have a special relationship with me just because I grew up in this town. And that is offensive. And then something more offensive, this may not be quite so obvious, but when he talks in verses 25 to 28 about the widow of Zarephath, the people who heard that story, the widow of Zarephath was a Gentile woman. And what he basically says that when the nation of Israel was involved in idolatry during the days of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, that's the context, and Elijah was the prophet, that Elijah was persecuted by his own people, and he had to go and reside in Gentile territory. And that was very shocking to the Jews, because the Jews thought, well, we're the people of God. The Gentiles are wicked, they're idolatrous, they're immoral. Unlike us, there was a certain national pride, right? And Jesus is he's directly rebuking that. And so Elijah was so persecuted, he had to leave the land of Israel. And so what did they do? They persecute Jesus. Ironically, they fall into the same pattern. It says in verse 28, they're filled with rage, right? They rose up and they cast him out of the city. They take him to the brow of the hill. And then kind of enigmatically, just as passing through their midst, he went his way. So somehow at the last minute, he just walks and his life is preserved. So otherwise, this would have been a very short ministry of Jesus. It wouldn't have been 3 years. It would have been more like 30 minutes. So there's an overshadowing of controversy from the beginning of the ministry of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. And the first people to respond to him are not the Pharisees, not the religious teachers. It's the people in his own hometown. So it's kind of an ironic beginning. Okay, any other comments on chapter 4? Okay, chapter 5, I talk about conflict. We already touched on conflict. I said, imagine yourself one of the Pharisees grumbling about Jesus. Why are the Pharisees grumbling? What is it that bothers them so much about Jesus? And those of you online, it looks like we can go with the, it looks like you can just speak up and people in the classroom can hear you. There are 5 of us total here. So we can all hear if you want to just speak.
I think he was having dinner with tax collectors.
Okay. So the Pharisees are upset because he's having dinner with the tax collectors. Can anyone put that into context? What would that be like in our culture? Do we have an equivalent of like what would be offensive? People that you wouldn't want to be associated with?
And criminals.
Okay, Tara says criminals. I sometimes ask people, you know, if you are a person who goes to worship, you know, what would the reaction be in your community if the Hell's Angels show up? You know, getting off the Harley, leather, tattoos, pierced, purple hair, whatever, you're sort of picture. Maybe not purple hair, but all the rest. Like, would this group be welcomed in, or would people say, "Whoa, stay on the other side of the sanctuary. We want to stay away from you"? Jesus made statements at certain points in the Gospels that truly were shocking, because he's invited by a group of religious leaders. At one point, he tells them, he said, the tax gatherers and the prostitutes will get into heaven before you will. Now, imagine a banquet. We have, we have the president of St. Louis University, the vice president, everything, some distinguished guest who comes in and says, the drug dealers in St. Louis and the prostitutes are really more righteous than you people are. It's like, would that person ever be invited to speak again by the leadership at St. Louis University? No. Maybe we don't have the same quite level of, let's say, religious identification in our culture that the first century Jews did have. But we have our, things that you say or don't say. And the tax gatherers were hated because they were collaborationists. Rome, of course, is an occupying power, and the tax gatherers, they not only collected the money for the Roman leaders, but they would were well known for extorting as much money as they could possibly get. So you have the tax gatherer who may be Jewish, right, knocking on the door, and the Roman soldier is like standing right alongside, right? And he goes into the house and he just takes out, oh, you got some expensive silverware. Okay, well, this will count for the tax. And guess what? He passes part of that he takes from your house to the Roman soldiers to pay the tax bill. But part of it is the unofficial, payback for himself. So he would take as much as he could, and he would give some fraction to the Roman and then keep the rest for himself. So not only is he collaborating with the Romans, but he's profiting off of his own people in this very oppressive situation. And that's why the story of the tax, Matthew was a tax gatherer. And in the Gospel of Matthew, it says he was sitting in his tax office and Jesus said, "Follow me." That would have been very surprising to a religious leader. Isn't this the last person you would ever ask to be part of your religious group? And then there's a story in chapter 19 of Luke about Zacchaeus, who is the little man, the little tax gatherer who climbed up in the tree because he wanted to see Jesus. And Jesus walks up and says, "Zacchaeus, come down, for I am dining in your house tonight." Yeah, Jesus invited himself into the home, and says Zacchaeus was very happy, and the Pharisees are grumbling. Jesus is just not respecting the boundaries that they had established between decent people and people who simply were indecent. You didn't want to be with these people who were bad, who were unfaithful to Jewish law. You didn't want to be associated with them. You wouldn't even want to mention their names in polite company. So one of the things that we see is this tendency of Jesus to go to those who are outside the boundaries of and it isn't that, one of the misunderstandings, I think sometimes people think Jesus thought it didn't matter how you lived. He didn't care. Read closely. Jesus sets down some very exacting standards of discipleship. But Jesus was also ready at the same time to meet people where they were. And so he believed that all human beings without exception had the capacity to respond to himself and to become disciples. He wouldn't write off any group from the outset the way that the religious leaders were prone to do. Okay, so let's, any other thoughts on chapter 5? It's kind of the interesting story about Peter there. This is where Peter tells Jesus to go away, to leave him. Chapter 5, verse 8. Peter sees this miraculous catch of fish. He felt Jesus' feet. He says, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." For amazement had seized him. Well, it's kind of interesting to think about that psychologically, what's going on. Already, he started to follow Jesus. Clearly, he has some relationship with Jesus already. But Peter, at this point, is humble. Peter, later in the gospel, is not very humble. Because when Jesus, much later, toward the end, says that all of those who followed him were going to fall away, what does Peter say? He says, even if all fall away, I will never depart from you. So he puts himself in a special category. And guess what? Peter does not keep his promise because he denies 3 times that he ever knew Jesus at all. So Peter, in a sense, is overconfident at that point. It's almost like he has to be broken and then put back together again. And later he emerges as a key leader in Acts of the Apostles. But at this point, he sees something in Jesus that is unnerving, even to him. Which is kind of interesting to think about, Jesus, that it wasn't a comfortable relationship even for the apostles. They were attracted, but there was something almost frightening about Jesus, something uncanny and unnerving to them. Okay, so in chapter 6, this is where we have, in Matthew chapters 5 to 7, we have the so-called Sermon on the Mount. Some of the same sayings appear in a variant form in Luke chapter 6. So this is sometimes called the Sermon on the Plain rather than the Sermon on the Mount. We have Beatitudes. These are the blessed statements. Blessed are you who are poor. Blessed are you who are hungry. Blessed are you who weep. Any thoughts about that? I mean, imagine, if you can, the first century Jews hearing this, blessed are you if you're poor, blessed are you if you're, imagine that today. If it's not, let's see, people today might know that this is quoting from the New Testament, but to be poor, to be hungry, to be weeping, to be hated. I mean, let's be honest, is that something that can be presented in a positive way? What really is the message here? I guess what I'm asking. Why would it be blessed to be poor? Yes.
I think like from a surface level, obviously like being poor or like hungry, that's not really ideal. But I think the messages here are saying like, blessed are you who are poor, but like as long as your morals and like your ideas and values are still
Okay, and sorry, your name is
Teresa.
Teresa. Yeah, Teresa is saying that it's only if you're
It's like
poor.
how you react to the situation.
Okay, yeah. So you're saying, Teresa, that poverty alone would not make you blessed. Just not having money, there has to be something more than
Like,
that.
if you were a really like terrible person and you were poor, it's kind of still the same, but like if you still like make the situation like make of it what you will,
Okay,
I guess.
right. It's if we went the direction of saying that poverty was a form of holiness, then we observe the world and we see that there are people with very little who are filled with hatred, envy, bitterness, and resentment toward everyone who has more than they do. How could that really be consistent with the rest of the message? So Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a great German theologian. He was put to death because of he opposed Hitler in World War II. But Bonhoeffer called it, he said, the Beatitudes show us the blessedness of having nothing but God. And you think about it that way. So it is the poor of this world, Jesus seems to be saying, and if we compare Matthew 5, if you're interested, you can compare the beginning of Matthew 5 with Luke verses 20 to 23, 24. You see there's similar sayings, but Luke is a little bit sharper in the way that he expresses them, that the poor of this world in Luke and in Matthew are open to the richness of God, the riches of God. And so you lose something in order to gain something. Jesus said, one of his paradoxical statements, he who seeks to save his life will lose it, but he who loses his life for my sake will find it. And so it's not simply negation for the sake of negation. If it were, then every one of us we should all have no possessions. We should wander disheveled, hungry, you know. But there's a point here that goes against the wisdom of the world, because the wisdom of the world will say, blessed are the rich, they'll have everything they want. Blessed are those, blessed are the aggressive, for they will inherit the real estate. That's kind of the worldly wisdom that existed in Jesus' day. It's still with us today. You want to get ahead, you want to advance yourself. And Jesus is fundamentally challenging that by saying that there is a blessedness that is more hidden, it seems to be contradictory to the world's ways of thinking. And it begins with poverty. It begins with, or if not physical poverty, at least a recognition of our poverty before God, that none of us come with wealth, with fullness before God. We come with empty hands to stretch out to God to receive forgiveness, guidance. The poor person is a dependent person. I mean, I'll tell you one story. I had a remarkable encounter with a woman. I regard her as like a contemporary saint. Her name is Heidi Baker. She grew up in Southern California, but she went to serve, kind of like Mother Teresa, the poorest of the poor, and she researched to find the poorest people in the world, and she found these war orphans in Mozambique. And what she said is that she'd spent 10 years among street people in Hong Kong. In fact, she moved into a neighborhood where people were shooting up, injecting, heroin into their veins, kind of in alleyways. There's dirty alleyways, syringes, used syringes here and there. And she said that the Lord had spoken to her and told her, learn from the poor. And she said she spent 10 years. She learned street Cantonese, so she learned all the street language. She said she sat alongside of poor people, and she said, what I learned was dependency. Because the person who genuinely is poor, if you have nothing at all, if everything we had was stripped away from us, we're just sitting on a street corner, we've got nothing to offer. There's a basic attitude of, yeah, I'm in need and I need someone to come through for me. And that attitude carried into relationship with God is what Jesus seems to be commending. Is that those who truly realize that everything good comes from God are open in a way that someone who, it's like they said of someone, they said he was too full of himself to be filled by anyone else. You know what I mean? It's like sometimes we can tend to be that way if we're impressed with ourselves. The person who walks in the room, assuming I'm the smartest, the most, the most brilliant, the most talented, the wealthiest, whatever, that kind of person walks in, they can't receive anything from anyone because they already feel that they have everything. So anyway, I spent a little bit more time on that, but it's a very important theme that goes through the gospel in terms of the teaching of Jesus, the paradoxical character, that poverty is a form of wealth, that what seems to be foolishness is a form of wisdom, that being marginal in this world can make you more central in terms of God's kingdom.
I learned this in like one class that I took last semester, but wouldn't that be like referring to as like the upside down kingdom? Like
Yes.
Whoever is first.
Yes.
Last.
Right, the upside down kingdom. Yep, that's a good phrase for it. It is upside down, and this was. It would be wrong to think that this was, oh yeah, that's the way people thought in the first century, but now we think differently. No, this message is challenging in every generation. In every generation of the world, we have a worldly way of thinking about things that emphasizes, look out for number one, advance yourself, play your cards well so you can get ahead of other people. And the message of Jesus is definitely a challenge to that. And honestly, the church, when the church becomes wealthy and powerful and respected, it loses this whole message. The Sermon on the Mount message, the Beatitude message begins to go by the wayside. There was a 19th century Danish philosopher you may have heard of called Søren Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard was very attuned to the paradox of Jesus' message. And he talks about going to the main cathedral in Copenhagen. And it was this beautiful building, right? Stained glass windows, and you have these, these gold, communion cup and everything. And then he talks about how the Archbishop of Copenhagen, Lutheran Archbishop, comes out and he has the staff, with emeralds and rubies, encrusted, that was hundreds of years old. And he says, with deep emotion in his voice, the Archbishop looks out at the crowd on this feast day and says that God loves the poor of this world. And then Kierkegaard comments, he said, but nobody laughs. But nobody laughs. So Kierkegaard's saying, doesn't anyone see the contradiction? The contradiction, it's all the richness of the institutional church and this message concerning poverty. There's another saying, it said, at the beginning, the church had chalices of wood and clergy of gold. And in the Middle Ages, someone complaining said, now the church has chalices of gold and clergy of wood. So this is very challenging stuff, no doubt about it. The liberation theologians have a certain perspective on this. It's controversial, but certainly this idea of the blessing pronounced upon the poor, this is something that's clear in Luke. Okay, so we'll just continue on to chapter 7, the compassion of Jesus. What about the centurion in chapter 7 who's commended for his faith? Can anyone say a little bit about that? Expound that a little bit. What is the significance of this centurion? Who is a centurion, by the way? What does that word mean?
Isn't it like a Roman soldier?
Okay, a Roman soldier.
And he repeatedly sent messengers out for him because he felt worthy of speaking directly.
Okay, the centurion. Okay, centurion, from the word century, a century is 100 years. A centurion was over 100 soldiers. There's someone above that level called a chiliarch who is over 1,000. But you don't become over 100 soldiers unless you have attained a certain rank. That meant that he would have been a battle-scarred veteran who probably had fought foreign wars, and he had risen up from being a raw recruit to actually having command over other men. And that becomes significant for what Jesus says in chapter 7. So now, why doesn't the centurion come directly to Jesus? Any speculation on that? Yeah, that's kind of a hard question. In ancient culture, this whole idea of being introduced to someone was very important. In fact, that's even 19th century culture. I was listening to the recording of Jane Austen, her book Pride and Prejudice, and the young women want to meet, who are of marriageable age, they want to meet a certain young man, but they haven't been introduced, right? You didn't just walk up and talk to someone. That's very contemporary, right? We have a very, very casual culture. In theory, you could be sitting next to someone on a plane or a park bench and you could strike up a conversation. But in most cultures of the world, it's like this idea of access to a person. And there's a huge cultural gap between the Roman soldier and this Jewish teacher, Jesus. So all through the gospel, you'll find that people are mediating for other people. So think of that, write that word down, mediation, social mediation. That's a key idea all through the gospel book. Who are the people who come directly to Jesus? Guess who? The most poor, the most marginal people, because there's no one who's going to introduce them. Someone who's a leper, they have to keep themselves aloof from everyone. They were supposed to cover their mouth like we do with the mask, and cry out. We're all lepers now, right? Unclean, unclean, leper. That's a bad joke. So we've all become lepers, social lepers, right? But in a sense, the lepers were supposed to keep themselves aloof from everyone. And so if a leper wanted to be healed, that's why with the leper, they just come directly to Jesus because they have no other way to come to him and they've got nothing to lose. They're down at the very bottom. I mean, it can only get better. It can't get any worse than if you're a leper living on the streets. There's the woman with the flow of blood. in Luke. Now, she was ceremonially unclean. She was not even supposed to go into the temple. And the physicians have been able to heal her. So she says, basically, I don't want to interrupt this very important man. I'm not introduced to him, but I'm just going to touch the fringe of his clothing. So she tries to get a healing from Jesus on the sly. But Jesus feels the power coming out from his body. Very interesting statement. He says, who touched me? Who touched me? And the disciples saying, well, lots of people are touching you, Jesus. What do you mean? And then he calls her back, and she's very embarrassed about that. But so this whole idea of introduction. Now, the person who is introducing the centurion are the leaders of the synagogue, right? So, okay, so look in chapter 7, verses 4 and 5. It says, when they had come to Jesus, they, Jewish elders, okay, that's verse 3. In Luke chapter 7, verse 3, Jewish elders. These were leaders of the Jewish community. Very interesting. They're saying, okay, here's a centurion. Here's a Roman soldier, one of this occupying force. You don't expect them to say a good thing about him, right? But they do. And they come to Jesus and they say, he is worthy for you to grant this to him, to heal his slave who was about to die. For he loves our nation. And it was he who built us our synagogue. So this person has made himself, he must have been drawn to the God of Israel. He may have been a proselyte. They don't use the word. That would be a Gentile convert to Judaism. He clearly is very closely connected. He's a lover of the Jewish people. And what does the centurion say? Verses 6 and 7. Lord, do not trouble yourself further, for I'm not fit for you to come under my roof. For this reason, I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you, but just say the word and my servant will be healed. For indeed, I am a man under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and he does it. Okay, so what is the centurion saying with this statement? Kind of an elaborate statement, isn't it? We have Jesus in verse 9, he marvels at the statement. But we have to understand what the centurion is saying. Anybody want to take a stab?
Back in the culture of the day, wouldn't it have been slightly, scandalous had Jesus gone into his home? So the centurion is kind of saying, I'm not going to put you in that position, but I guess I'm going to have faith.
Right. Yeah. No. Yeah. The social. Yeah. Right. Ross has commented that. Yeah. That. Yes. There is great social distance. Now again, Jesus is a very atypical, Jewish rabbi because he is associating with the tax gatherers, with these renegades. But going to the home of centurion, that might have been almost a bridge too far in some ways. And maybe the centurion may be trying to avoid embarrassment to Jesus. But the statement, the whole thing, I'm a man. He doesn't say I'm a man of authority or a man with authority, but I'm a man under authority. Now that's very significant. And again, I don't want to overinterpret it, but he's saying I have a realm under my authority and that are under me, and then I am under a higher authority. And basically he's looking at Jesus healing. And if Jesus is a man under authority, not with authority, what he's saying is Jesus must have someone higher than himself. In other words, God. He's basically saying you are doing these healings because God must have sent you. You follow that? I too am a man under authority. I'm following orders from a higher authority that is above me. And this is, I think, why Jesus was so amazed, and he says, I've not found such great faith even in Israel. Yeah, and Peter instead is saying, what am I, chopped liver? That was not complimentary to the Jewish disciples of Jesus, because he's basically saying, this is the most amazing statement of faith I've ever heard. Because of the centurion, even as a Gentile, now of course he's connected to the Jewish people, but he's seeing something that Jesus is only able to do this not because he has miraculous power or some kind of magician, but because he's under authority. And there's a similar statement in, I'll just skip over to John chapter 3, verse 2. Nicodemus comes to Jesus. This is what you call Nick at night. You don't have to laugh. And when Nicodemus, the leader of the Pharisees, he says, Rabbi, we know that you have come from God as a teacher, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him. That's a similar statement. It's a statement of faith that you must have been sent by God because you have the power of God working in and through you. Okay, so there's other healing. There's actually a resuscitation of a dead man in this passage who rises up, begins to speak, and fear grips them all. This is verse 16. This is also later in the chapter. A great prophet has arisen among us. God has visited his people. Okay, there is a question about John also that comes up. John comes back into the story at the end of Luke 7, last part of Luke 7. What do we learn about John from this this section? If you've gotten to this far along, anybody? How about someone who hasn't spoken so far? John the Baptist in Luke chapter 7. What's John's relationship to Jesus at this point? Let's see. James, Zoe, Benjamin, Megan, Eugene, Madison, Andrew, Armina.
Well, I kind of took it as John being sent to prepare people for the coming of Jesus.
Okay.
And I guess Jesus might have wanted to clarify this to the crowd to maybe prevent them from making inaccurate surface level judgments about John based on how humble he looked, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's a bunch of things that are happening here. To go back to the start of the passage, and it's a complex passage. I asked you a hard question, but in verse 19, not John himself, but John the Baptist's disciples come to Jesus and say, "Are you the one who is coming, or do we look for someone else?" And they ask him this question. Not even the biblical commentators are all agreed. There are two schools of thought here. One school of thought is that John was completely certain in his faith that Jesus was the coming one, meaning the Messiah, the coming Savior for the Israelites, but that the disciples were a little bit unsure. And John is at this point, so John may have been sending his disciples for them to ask the question, say, well, go and check it out. Go ask him, are you the coming one? But there's another school of thought that John, who has been imprisoned under Herod because he preached that Herod was illicitly married to his former sister-in-law. That was considered incest under Jewish law. John did not refrain from preaching against the wife of the king, and she plotted, and it's a very scandalous episode where Herodias, the daughter, dances before Herod, and Herod is probably drunk at the time, and she pleased him, which probably means he was sexually excited by her. And he says, I'll give you anything up to half my kingdom, right? Which is basically saying, hey, I'll replace your mother with you. It was a very seedy episode. And then she goes back to her mother's, what should I ask for? It says, ask for the head of John the Baptist on the platter. So she comes back, and so John is later after this executed. But I think John was already in prison at this point. So one theory is that John is in prison. Later he is going to be executed, but he started to lose his own faith, and that he needs to be reassured. So Tara, you had a question? Well, yes, that would be the view. Didn't he already know? It's a very interesting question. I think it's not completely clear, but the answer of Jesus is clear. It was, go and report to John what you have seen and heard. This is verse 22. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have the gospel preached to them, and blessed is he who keeps from stumbling over me. So Jesus, in that passage, is appealing to the miracles themselves are signs of his true identity. And then Jesus has some nice things about John, but when does he say it? After the messengers have left. Verse 24. This was not flattery to put into the ears of the messengers of John that they would take back to John, but after the messenger's gone, that's when he begins to speak about John's unique identity. And he talks about, he says that among those born of women, there is no one greater than John. That's verse 28, chapter 7. He says, yet he who is least in the kingdom of God is greater than he. Oh, there's a great paradox. What does that mean? John is the greatest of born of women, but the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. So it's as if John was the greatest thing in this earlier age that was ending during the life of Jesus, but something new was beginning that was greater than John. And then he goes on and he talks about the inconsistency of the Pharisees, because John is self-denying, he's fasting, he's living in the desert. Says he ate locusts and honey. And they said, oh, he has a demon. And then Jesus is eating and drinking wine, and they say he's a glutton. So he's basically saying, hey, you can't make, the critics want it both ways, because they criticize John and they criticize Jesus either way. But then he goes on and to commend John and to talk about his unique role. And then we didn't even get to let's see, the woman who washes Jesus' feet with her tears. I already alluded to that. We definitely need to talk about this. We need to finish chapter 7. We'll see how far we get next time. But okay, let's talk about this passage as well. The woman who washes Jesus' feet with her tears. So why is she going to Jesus, do you think?
I think that like the way she's like described is, like if you only knew what she's done and all that for like sin, it's kind of like to that point of she's such like an outcast in kind of this household and by these individuals that she doesn't really have much else. She doesn't have anything to lose. Kind of like when we were alluding to like the individuals with leprosy. Right. She doesn't have anything to lose. It's just strictly at this moment her faith that is just her.
Clearly, there's something she sees in Jesus that draws her to him, even if it's not completely defined. She sees something in him that she desires. She is like a moral leper, not a physical leper, but morally speaking. They say that she is a sinner, and Simon says in his heart, he thinks if this man were a prophet, verse 39, he would know who and what sort of a person this woman is. I mean, I think it's about 99% certain that she was a prostitute. I think that's almost certain. This particular passage gets conflated and confused with the discussion of Mary Magdalene. Nothing in this text identifies this woman as Mary Magdalene. The only thing that we know in Luke, it says that Mary Magdalene had 7 demons cast out from her. In the Christian tradition, in the Catholic development of the Saint Mary Magdalene, or Magdalena in some languages, there's this idea that she had been a prostitute and been converted. And you find that if you watch the Passion of the Christ movie, Mary Magdalene is kind of assumed. And the other thing is a woman caught in adultery in the beginning of John chapter 8. That's still another separate episode. That we can't identify that woman as Mary Magdalene. In that case, we know that the woman is said to have been in adultery. It doesn't say she was a prostitute, but it says she was caught in adultery. And of course, no man is called before Jesus. So it's interesting. She was committing adultery all by herself. I'm being tongue in cheek here. We have the sexual double standard there at work in John chapter 8. But these are all separate passages, and they kind of got run together in later Christian interpretation. But it's almost certain she's a prostitute. I think that the expensive, very expensive ointment that or vial that she's pouring out, alabaster that was so expensive, must have been something that she used in her trade as a prostitute. But I don't know, it's a very striking passage because she walks right past the men in black, so to speak, right to the feet of Jesus. And it's almost like she doesn't care whether they approve of this. You know that either she had to force her way in, or they gave her looks that could kill, when she walked past them. Like, what are you doing here? But Jesus, he doesn't commend what she's done because he says her sins are many. Verse 47, for this reason I say to you, her sins which are many have been forgiven, for she loved much, but he who is forgiven little loves little. And then he announces to her, your sins have been forgiven. That was like an added scandal. So we have a moral scandal, this woman even being close to Jesus, touching his body, this prostitute, well-known, infamous prostitute. That's a moral scandal. But then you have a religious, theological scandal, because Jesus is, who is this man who even forgives sins? And then he tells the woman, your faith has saved you, go in peace. So she's commended and sent off and given a word of encouragement that isn't given to the religious leaders. So this is an upside down kingdom. This is a reversal of what we'd expect. Okay, I think we can stop there. Zoe asked a question, are the Luke questions due this Sunday the only individual assignment to be turned on? Yes. So I'm asking you to do that as an individual assignment. And then from that point on, I'd like you to meet in your groups this week, begin to get to know one another, and you could do a little bit of work sharing some ideas to fill out your work on Luke. Again, I'd like you to write that up individually, but you can share ideas and as you talk through the later chapters. Well, we didn't get quite as far. I hope to get at least chapter 8. Maybe we can pick up the pace. And please continue to work on those questions. And we're going to be really unpacking some of the implications of these ideas that we're skimming through right now. So if you feel like you don't have it's a jigsaw puzzle and some of the pieces don't seem to be in place, that's okay, because we're just doing a initial reconnaissance right now, like the plane flying over the territory. We're seeing the lay of the land, where the mountains are, where the river runs, where the fields are, and we're going to go back and fill in the detail later on. So let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to text me, feel free to email me, and I'll set up that the Google Drive so you can upload your homework there. So, and I'll also send you the recording for the class too. So, all right, see you Thursday.